Tractate Bava Metzia, page 88. We start at the very bottom of 87b. Here we are dealing with Hilchot Ma'asrot, the subject of Chiyuv Trumot Ma'asrot, the obligation of giving tithe. It's a discussion, soon you see the difference between the Oraita and the Rabbanan. It's a biblical or rabbinic. The idea of untightened produce, which is any type of fruits or other vegetables or any produce that they are basically obligated to take a tithe, but they are not temporarily, you treat it in a certain way. So here, Amar Rabbi Yanai hold that when you have the owner of the untightened produce, so he said, En hatevel mitchayev, is not obligated to do the mitzvah of tightening, because we need to have, as we learned in the previous daf, the Gmar Melacha, the completion of the work. So here, since you have the pile of the produce, and it didn't complete it, so the Torah said, Bi'arti HaKodesh min habayit, a person needs to make a declaration that I take any consecrated item, so even that he did a keri, which is the pile of the produce, and also did the mericha. But the obligation is, until you enter the domain of the house or the courtyard, you do not have the obligation. So here Rabbi Yanai said that the owner of untightened produce is not obligated to do the mitzvah of tightening, because even the Torah have a strong language of the ad sheyira'eh pnei habayit. So until he sees the front of the house, and soon you see the difference between Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yanai, in a way, it's stronger. He says that he needs to go through the house, the idea that people enter and exit, and you have to pass to the entrance of the house, because that's the understanding, the formulation of this text of the Torah. Page 88, Ayt sheyira'eh pnei habayit shene'emar, because it's written, Bi'arti HaKodesh min habayit, part of the statement that one needs to say upon the tightening, which called it, this is the declaration of the tightening. The Torah said, I have removed the consecrated item from the house, which is that you have the fulfillment of the obligation to take a produce. Here a person living in Eretz Israel, he is blessed with the produce, he needs to tighten it. So the purpose of that tightening was not yet fulfilled, because the designated area, which is applied only upon entering the house, then he could fulfill the obligation. So in that sense, what Rabbi Yanai tells us, that if a person enters to a kind of weird way, window, roof, backyard, etc., it doesn't hold that obligation, Rashi said. Now, the source speaks about vidui ma'asrot, the confession that one needs to take upon giving a tightening. This is basically the 7-year cycle that we talk many times. The people who live in Eretz Israel, they have an obligation to go by the Shemitah, by the 7 years cycle, and when it's come to the eve of Pesach, in a certain years, here we talk about the 4th and the 7th year for this Shemitah, the sabbatical cycle, everyone needs to take the previous 3 years of the tightening and bring it to its owner. So that's part of the obligation. And since the Torah used this term, Bi'arti HaKodesh, I get rid, I have removed the consecrated item from the house, within the house, so it's in a sense a physical obligation. The question is the disputation between Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi Yochanan amar afilu chatzer kovat, even bringing produce to the courtyard determines that the production process of the produce has been completed, and that the produce is therefore subject to tithe. it's basically the disputation if this idea of tightening is biblical or not. Rabbi Yanai said that these produce have the obligation only if they say ra'iti pnei habayit, if the entrance to the house, but he hold with all due respect that as far as the rabbinic law, it is an obligation to give ma'asrot, even, Tosfot said, even if they come from the yard or other location. That Tosfot based it on Mishnah in Tractate Ma'asrot, chapter 3, Mishnah number 5. So here Rabbi Yochanan hold that even Chatzer, even the courtyard, is determined that it's accepted. So therefore, he needs to bring a source, and he brings the source from the same framework of the psukim. Over there it's written, ve'achlu bish'arecha, and they shall eat in your gates, ve'saveu, and they shall be satisfied. So here you see the source according to Rabbi Yochanan, that it's go by the courtyard. Now the Gemara asks a question. Rabbi Yochanan name aktiv min habayit, but Rabbi Yochanan also recognized the previous pasuk that said it Torah from the house. So the Gemara said, Amar lach chatzer dumya de bayit. He said that here you make a comparison between the courtyard that is similar to bringing it into the house. Ma bayit hamishtamer. You talk about a courtyard that must be secure. House, I'm saying, the same way as the house is in a secure area, af chatzer hamishtamer, the same way as a courtyard must be secure. So the moment you have a certain domain, certain area that is accessible to the public, so it's not considering a courtyard for the idea, for the notion or the purposes of Jewish law. So now the Gemara challenged Rabbi Yanai's view. Rabbi Yanai name aktiv bish'arecha. If you go by Rabbi Yanai, the Torah said in your gate. So it means if the produce enter from the gate of the courtyard, they're obligated to give a tithe. Haomi ba'alei dim ayel lei derech sha'ar. The obligation to give this tithe is only when he entered toward the gate meaning the gates that they enter to the house, le'apukei, to exclude if it enters to where? Derech gagot vekarpifot dela. But if they go, in other words, if it's an entrance way to the exclusion of the produce that brought through the roof parts and the enclosures, so the produce is not subject to that tithe, because he hold it has to be, and that's by the way the Rashba view. The Rashba said in short that you have to have two obligations. Number one, if the produce go through the courtyard, we have the obligation to give ma'asro, to give tithe. But he says, according to Rashba, the understanding is that it has to be from the, if it's come from the enclosure, chatzer sha'ar charit, from the backyard, so you don't have the chiyuv ma'asrot. Tosfot said that the only machlokeh, the disputation, is specifically midoraita, because according to Rabbi Yanai, that's the Tosfot understand, is dafka ma'abayit, specifically from the house. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, even irap nei chatzer, even it brings from the enclosure, from the courtyard. So what do we see? We see that between both of them, Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan, they're all that even after Gmar Melechet HaPerot, even upon completion of doing this produce, and is still not obligated to bring tithe until they enter to the courtyard, according to Rabbi Yochanan, or to the house, according to Rabbi Yanai. So now the Gemara challenges from something that we learned in the previous daf, 87b. Metiv Rav Chanina Choza'ah. The pasuk said in Dvarim, chapter 23, verse 25. The pasuk said, "Ve'achalta anavim ken nafshecha," and you eat this grape, ken nafshecha, according to your wishes. So he said, "Kach nafsho shel poel." Ma nafshecha ata ochel upatur, af nafsho shel poel ochel upatur. You talk about the labor. So the labor can eat, and is exempt from giving tithe. So it means that the laborer is exempt from giving tithe over this grape. It's because he's eating them, and it's not considered as a purchaser. So they said, ha lokeach chayav. But if you talk about a person who buys the produce, so the Torah requires him to separate the tithe before partaking it. So they said, Maila basadeh. You have to say that application it has to be for the tithing the produce, even though it was not entered his house or courtyard. So Gemara said, Rav Papa, hacha bit'eina ha'omedet begina. Here we're dealing with the fig tree that is standing in the garden outside the courtyard. So that's just as an example, right? The Meforshim said, you see also that in the Rambam, that the case of Mishnah also said that just as an example, בתאנה עומדת לגינה ונופה נוטה לתוך החצר. So here you have a situation that the fig tree is standing in the garden outside the courtyard, but leaves are leaning into the courtyard, or can go the other way around. But the idea is, ולמאן דאמר לבית, labai. So this applies to one who said that it's leaning into the house. So consequently, the produce enter the courtyard or enter the house. So Rashi, you see it also in Tosfot, said that it wasn't the intent of the buyer only in this situation that the fig tree leaning toward the courtyard or the house, because if you go by the Mishnayot, we learn that the one who purchased it and take it from the field or from the produce, he basically have the act of kinyan, the acquisition, even before they enter the courtyard. So it has to be, that's the Torah Chaim understand from our Tosfot, that what's the brighter to tell you that the obligation to tighten applies biblically by the one who purchased it. It's specifically when those produce enter the courtyard or the house. But if they did not enter, it's still you have the framework of giving tighten, but it's not biblical, it's rabbinic. The question is, the way that Tosfot in general challenge all this concept is, what's the story of the fig tree standing totally in the courtyard or in the house? The moment you have this efnei chatzer, it's already have the obligation. But anyway, the question is if you're required specifically to go through the entrance or not. It's as we said, the Ramban, the Rashba, the Ran have a discussion over that. Iachi. So the Gemara asks the question, if so, if the homeowner himself, not only the buyer. So if the homeowner himself should also obligated to separate tithe, as the produce is on either the courtyard or the house, that's the way Rashi understand. The Tosfot challenged the whole idea of tightening in this situation. But anyway, Baal Habayit namim nichayev. So you have the obligation also, the owner, to separate out. So the Gemara said, Baal Habayit einav bit'einato v'lokeach einav b'mikcho. It's a two different mindset. The owner, the homeowner, he thinking is the tree. He doesn't care for the produce, he just cares for the tree. So the main part of the tree is outside the courtyard. Versus the buyer, what he think? He think the produce itself. So there's a space of the courtyard, or it's in the house. So the Gemara asks, "V'lokeach midoraita mi mechayev?" Do you mean to say that the buyer is obligated by Torah to tithe the produce he purchases? Ve'atanya, we learn in the Braita, מפני מה חרבו חנויות של בית הינו 3 שנים קודם ירושלים. As we all know, unfortunately, Yerushalayim, the holy city of Jerusalem, destroyed. It was the destruction of the city, but here you have a location that is called Bet Hino. It was a town in that ancient time that close in proximity to Yerushalayim, and is destroyed earlier, prematurely, for the destruction of Yerushalayim by 3 years. So they explain that the reason for that, the spiritual reason that caused them to have the destruction, מפני שהעמידו דבריהם על דברי Torah, which is they not adhere themselves to rabbinic safeguard. They just go by the Torah, and basically Rashi said here, כלומר, מה שאסרו מדברי חכמים מצאו לו יותר מן התורה. So Rashi used the word כלומר, I think, to emphasize that there are those who play the games and try to say, it's not biblical, it's rabbinic, and they try to find a way to get away from that. So that's basically caused them that strong punishment. But shehayu omrim, because the Bride explained that they will say, 88b, aser te'aser ve'achalta. The Torah obligated that, this is the book of Dvarim, chapter 14, we are obligated to do a tightening, and here the Torah, in a simple literal text of the Pasuk, it is speaking about Ma'aser Sheni b'Yerushalayim, the second tithe that is giving in the holy city of Yerushalayim, which is, you should know, the Ritva said, you should eat it in Yerushalayim, and the rest of the crop you can eat it anywhere, but the obligation of tithing is only the crop that you eat and not something that you sell. So they said, Velo mocher tvuat zarecha velo lokeach. So the obligation is not the one who sells it, not one who buys it. So here you have basically four different views what exactly the exemption of the purchaser by the biblical term. The whole gather, the whole definition of exemption. You go by the Rambam, the Rambam in Ilchot Ma'aser, chapter 2 said, from the Pasuk, Aser te'aser, you shall tithe. By Torah law, one is obligated to separate tithes only if his produce has been processed, which means its work is completed. One who completes the work of his produce in order to sell it is exempt from separating tithes by Torah law, although he is obligated to do so by rabbinic law. Likewise, one who purchases produce after its works has been completed is exempt from separating tithes by Torah law, but is obligated to do so by rabbinic law. If he purchased the produce before its work was completed, he is obligated to separate tithes by Torah law. So that's one avenue. You have the avenue of Rabbeinu Tam that was brought in a Tosfot previously, that said that exemption of that purchaser and the buyer applies for the produce שנגמרה מלאכתם, that completed their work, which means if someone take it after they completed, he is exempt from giving a tithe by biblical term, but before it's not considering as a lokeach, they have to tithing. Now the third one you see is the Rivam, and you see the Rivam also in Tosfot. That's basically opposite the Shita, the view of Rabbeinu Tam. And this third view said that the idea of the notion that the Torah exempt the seller and the buyer, it's only lifnei gmar melacha, before the completion of the work, which means you sell the produce before the completion of the work. So then they exempt from tithing, but if it's already completed, they have the chiyuv of maaser, the obligation to tighten, and it was not reseen or abrogated by selling it. The fourth one is the Ravid, and the Ravid said, you see it in the case of Mishnah Ilchot Maaser, chapter Aleph. And again, it's the idea is that by Torah law, a buyer is exempt in all cases. This is one avenue, but you have to know that all of this discussion applies to different avenues as far as the Torah is concerned when it comes to tightening. Everyone agrees that when it comes to rabbinic enactment, there are the obligation and it's withstanding there. That's what the Gemara said. אלא מדרבנן הוקרא אסמכתא be'alma. So that's basically the pasuk. It's just the supports the halacha. So you see here, those people who live in Bet Hino did not adhere to rabbinic law and did not observe the halacha requiring the buyer to separate tithe. So you see many times, as you see a statement in the Gemara, and you see a pasuk that's basically alluded to certain halachot, but it's not the actual source. Sometimes it's used as a term of asmachta. Here, I'd like to share with you something from the book called Likutei Batar Likutei. As we see, we find here that the stores of Beit Hino were destroyed because, although they fulfilled Torah law, they neglected a rabbinic enactment. So as we said earlier, that Rashi explains that they found a source in the Torah that permitted what our sages had forbidden. So Maran Achidah, the great Sephardic rabbi, wonders about this Rashi. Isn't everything our sages forbade permitted according to the Torah? He gives a powerful answer based on the Taz in Yoredea 1:17, and I quote, "If we consider this in light of the Taz's words, it becomes clear." He explained that the sages cannot forbid anything explicitly permitted in the Torah, but they can forbid what is permitted by a drasha. The purpose of Beit Hino overturned a decree of our sages that contradicts a drasha, and consequently the people of Beit Hino were punished for this. So the Noam Megadim explains this, the whole Malach, but a little different. He said this means that they did not see their mistake. Even if a person made a Aveira, he made a sins, if he at least sees that he is not acting properly, then the Almighty waits, and he will usually repent for his erroneous ways. If a person justified everything he does wrong, this is much more cause the problem, because since he will never understand that he must change afterward from his twisted viewpoint, his actions are completely consistent with the Torah. So therefore, that's the idea of people of Beit Hino severely punished. This is from a book called Likutei Batar Likutei. So what you see here that the superfluous word of kenafshecha is not to tell us that labor exempt from giving tithe. So ela kenafshecha lemai ata. So what's the word kenafshecha in the pasuk, in the verse, meant, what it's come to teach us? So since the Torah said, Rashi explained to us, that the lokeach patu b'maser, that the one who purchases is exempt from giving tithe, so the pasuk doesn't need to teach us that the labor is exempt. So they said, lichdetanya kenafshecha. Ma nafshecha im chasamta patu, af poel im chasamta patu. So again, this is kind of sounds harsh, but the idea is, if you not allow the labor to eat, you are exempt from liability for the transgression of muscling an ox while it is walking. That's in a way we learn in the verbal juxtapositions. Because the way we understand in the Torah, if someone have the animal and avoiding her while the animal doing work to eat, so he's basically in violation of negative commandment and deserve malkot. That's lo tachsom shor bedishor. The Torah said in Deuteronomy 25, you shall not muzzle an oxen while he is doing his job. So that's basically the learning from that in comparison to our discussion here. So in general, the Shulchan Aruch in Choshen Mishpat in 337 said that it is forbidden to deny a labor his right to eat by Torah law. You see also in the Rambam in L'chot Schirut chapter 13, because the idea is that if the employer prevented the laborer from eating, he must compensate him or her for the loss, although he's not liable to receive malkot. So the Gemara said, Mativ Mar Zutra. So here you have an objection from Mar Zutra to the word of Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan. This is a Mishnah in Tractate Maasrot, chapter 1, Mishnah number 5. Eizehu gornan lemaasrot. So he said, what is the equivalent of their granary, which is the point at which the processing of various type of produce is completed so that they become subject to the halachot of titans? So that's basically the idea of the Mishnah. What exactly considering as a Gemar Melacha, that you have the obligation to give a titan. And soon we're going, if time allowed, to read the Rambam in the Perusha Mishnayot. But basically they said, Bekishuim uvidluim misheyipaksu. So here we talk about cucumbers and gourds. They become obligated from when they lose their blossom. So here we are with the Rambam, Hilchot Maaser, chapter 3. I'm reading from Rav Steinzel's Koren edition, the translation of this Rambam. One may eat a casual meal from produce whose work has not yet been completed until it is brought into his house. As soon as one begins completing its work after it has been brought into the house, he is obligated to tithe all the produce. For example, cucumbers and gourds reach the completion of their processing when one rubs and removes the half-like substance that covers them. So this stage in the process is called the granary, a term borrowed from the processing of grain, and if one does not intend to rub them, they are considered process when he gathers them into a pile. That's the idea of carry. So he said, excuse me, he said, ואמר רב אסי משינטל פיקס שלהם, מה אליו, which is the פיקס, the completion, you remove the hair, that's גמר מלאכה. מה אליו משיפקסו אפילו בשדה. So you said that the time that they lost their blossom, even when the produce is still in the field. So the Gemara said, לא, משיפקסו בבית. When they lost the blossom, specifically in the house or courtyard, which is the house or courtyard rents the produce subject to tithe only when the produce loses its blossom. So the Gemara asks, אחרי משייפקסו. So the Mishnah should have said until they lost the blossom. So they said עד שיפקסו מבעלי, איתן עד שיפקסו, אבל מן עד שגמר לפיקוסיו. Which means the total, you have the removal of the blossom from all the produce. כמה שמלון שיפקסו מכי התחולי פיקוסיהו. That when they begin to lose their blossom. So even the Torah Chaim said, even he did 1 or 2, it's already need to give tithe, even if it's not completed. That's the Ritva said that this is the enactment of Rabbanan, Takanat Rabbanan, the sages' enactment, Me'ein Deoraita. Mativ Ramar Zutra B'Red Rav Nachman, Gorno Lemaser L'Chayev Alav Mishum Tevel. Tevel, as we said, it's the untied produce. So if someone intentionally eats tevel, that biblically is obligated to titheness, so he's deserved to get his violation of negative commandment, deserve mitabidei shamayim, a punishment from heaven. So they said, mishtegamer melachtam, when they walk, is completed. So the Gemara asks, ve'ezu Gemarrah melachtam, give me the definition of that completion of work. Melechet achnasatan when they brought in, מה אליו הכנסתן אפילו בשדה, even they are in a field. They said, no, it's not this, הכנסתן לבית, זהו גמר מלאכתם. When you brought it to the house, it's considered the completion of its work. Another option, ויבייתי מקיק, אמר רבי ינאי בזיתים וענבים, דלאו בני גורן הינו. What Rabbi Yanai said specifically, he speak about olives and grapes, which are not a granary, which since these types of produce are not processed in a granary, which is the typical way of for rendering produce subject to tithe, they become subject to tithes when they are brought into the house or courtyard. So he said, אבל חיטים ושעורים, גורן בהדיה כתיב בי. But when it's come to wheat or barley, a granary is explicitly written with regard to them. So therefore, they are subject to tithes in the granary, even before they are brought into the house or courtyard. So Tosfot basically have here a mahalach that according to Rabbi Yoshaya, the moment that he entered with the mode patur, even if then he's zore pnei habayit. The Gemarrah, we understand that only if ichnis v'sider, that's Mishei Paksu, that then he needs to bring the tithe. But the idea is, we have to have a chiluk, we have a differentiation between chitin and sorin versus moreach. But kishuin, the guards, so that's the different, because there's a big discussion among the poskim, what exactly you hold Trumat Masot in this, say, based on also in Gemarrah and Brachot. But anyway, you see it in a book called Derech Emunah, Hilchot Maaser, chapter 3, and also you see it in Iran and the Ritva. So now, after the Gemara completed the discussion on the subject of Riyat Pnei Habayit, so now they bring the source from the Torah, the whole rules of labor, the obligation or the rights for a laborer to eat. Ash kechan adam b'mchubar, shor betalush. So we found a source for that, how a person may eat from the attached produce while walking in the field. The same about to ox, the attached product. Adam she'ochel b'mchubar and odin she'ochel betalush. So a person who's walking may eat from detached produce. So the Torah said clearly that we are obligated to master the oxen. So in other words, you're not allowed to do it while he's in the process of eating. You're not muscling him. תאמר באדם שאתה מצווה על חסימתו, said a person that you are not commanded with regard to his muscling. So גמרא דסמה, ויד המצווה על חסימתו מקל וחומר מישור. can learn the same קל וחומר from ox. מה שאתה מצווה לאחיותו, אתה מצווה על חסימתו. אדם שאתה מצווה לאחיותו, וחי אחיך עמך, you're obligated to take care of your fellow, to take care of the עניי ישראל, Rashi said, and more. אין יודעים שאתה מצווה על חסימתו, so how much so that Torah obligated us to take parnasa of human more than animals. So they said, אמרת כנפשך כנפשו של פועל. מה נפשו אם חסמתו פטור, אף פועל אם חסמתו פטור. Same way, so you have a laborer, if you muscle him, you're exempt from punishment for violating the transgression of muscling an ox while he's walking. ואל האדם בתלוש מנהלן. So, from where do we derive that a person may eat from detached produce? Omar Kra, you have the pasuk that teach us in a verbal juxtaposition of using the same words, verbal analogy in the Dvarim 23 verse 26. The Torah used the word kama, meaning standing kama shtei pe'amim. It's written twice. So what do we derive from that? Im eino inyan le'adam bimchubar, ולפנהו עניין לאדם בתלוש. If it's not applied to the matter of the right of a person to eat from attached produce, apply it to the matter of the right of a person to eat from detached produce. רבי אבי אמר, אדם בתלוש לא צריך קרא. כתיב, כי תבוא בחרב רעך, מי לא עסקינן ששכרו לכתף, that will hire the labor to transport the grapes out of the vineyard. ואמר רחמנא לאכול. And the Torah, the merciful one, said what? That he may eat. So it means that the laborer can eat from that produce, that they are detached. So since we learn the right of the laborer to eat from the detached, even it's ambiguous, it's not clear from the pasuk. So now the Gemarrah wants to add another din, that again it wasn't clear. They said, Shor bimchubar menalan. So we understand the prohibition of muscling an ox. That applies to what? Something that is detached, you cannot do it to him. For example, you have legumes that he detach it, he just pull it behind him. So he said, Shor bimchubar menalan. From where do we derive that an ox must be allowed to eat from attached produce? So here we use the same kal vachomer me'adam. There's a ritva here. Anyway, מאדם. ומה אדם שאינו אוכל בתלוש אוכל במחובר, שור שאוכל בתלוש אינו דין שאוכל במחובר. If you talk about a person that is not eat while he is occupied himself with the detached, which means there is no explicit verse to permit him to do it, but nevertheless may eat from attached produce. So with regard to an ox, which must be allowed to eat from detached produce, is it not right that it must also be allowed to eat from attached produce? So the Gemarrah said no, they rejected that. Why? מה לאדם שכן אתה מצווה להחיותו? As we said earlier, that the Torah is very strict, that one should take care of his fellow and make sure that he live properly. תאמר בשור שאין אתה מצווה להחיותו. You don't have a clear text in the Torah that obligated one to take care of the ox, to sustain the ox. So he said, ויהא שור מצווה להחיותו מקל וחומר. So may we learn from a kal vachomer that one is commanded to sustain an ox to prevent the suffering of living creatures. That's the idea of צער בעלי חיים. ומה אדם שאתה מצווה על חסימתו, אתה מצווה להחיותו? You don't have love, you don't have malkot when you have a muscling a labor, but you have the obligation to make him survive, to live. שור שאתה מצווה על חסימתו, that not allowed to muscle him, אינו דין שאתה מצווה להחיותו, אמר קרא, so Gemarrah said, וכי אחיך עמך, אחיך ולא שור. Just use a logical thinking. When the Torah said you have the obligation that your brother should live with you. So what is the mean? You have the obligation to sustain your fellow, your brother. It's not obligation to do it by the ox. So the Gemarrah go back to the original question, ולשור במחובר מנהלן. So how do you learn that the ox must be allowed to eat from attached produce? So Gemarrah now learn from a verbal analogy, from juxtaposition in the deriving from the book of Dvarim, chapter 23, verse 26. The Torah said, רעך שתי פעמים. Torah said the word your neighbor twice. So what we derive from that? Im eno inyan le'adam, if it doesn't teach us the right of a person במחובר, תנאו עניין, לשור במחובר. So you apply it to a matter of ox, that they're allowed to eat from attached produce. Another source, רבינה אמר, לא אדם בתלוש ולא שור במחובר, these psukim are not necessary either for the halacha that a person may eat from detached produce, or for the halacha that an ox must be allowed to eat from attached produce. Why? Because the pasuk said it, the text said in Dichtiv, in Dvarim 25 verse 4, Lo tachsom shor bedishor, you shall not muzzle an ox in its threshing. Page 89, Michdi kol milei itnehu b'chasima. So you talk about all animals, that's part of that's included in the halacha of muzzling. So Rashi said he klomar al korchacha shor lav davka vekol shar behemot itnu betorat chasima. That's the Rashi said that it's that you derived. You have to say that it's not just the ox, the all animals that are part of that halacha. The Alfinan, we learn from this verbal analogy, shor mi Shabbat. Because in Shabbat, the Torah also used the word shor, the ox, prohibited to do work on Shabbat, like chamar, achar behema, etc. So what did the Torah say? Torah said, v'chol be'emterah. It said shor, it says in any type of animal. So what did it? Im ken lichtov rachmana, lo tadush b'chasima, shor de ketav rachmana lamali. Why they specifically use the term of ox? So the Gemarrah said, la'akushe, you derive from that, chosem lenechsam v'nechsam lechosem. So the superfluous word of ox come to teach us a very important juxtaposition and compare one who muzzles to one who muzzles animal, and likewise to compare the muzzled animal to one who muzzles. Ma chosem ochel bimchubar, just as one who muzzles, a human, a person, may eat from a produce attached to the ground, af nechsam ochel bimchubar, the same way as one who muzzles animal may eat from attached produce. ומה נחסם אוכל בתלוש, אף חוסם אוכל בתלוש. So the same way as just as one muzzles animal may eat from detached produce, so too the one who muzzles us may eat from detached produce. So the whole idea of lo tachsom, it's going to be a subject of the next daf, the whole concept of laboral right to eat while he's walking is deriving from this basic discussion of the daf today.